1,500 pounds, no drive shaft, 215 miles per hour on the Daytona banking. In 1963, Chevrolet had a Cobra killer. You have never heard of it. Bill Thomas had close to 100 racing wins in Corvettes by 1962. Then Carroll Shelby showed up with the Cobra and Corvettes stopped winning. Thomas picked up the phone and called Ed Cole. In 1963, Cole ran GM's car and truck division. He was the man who had greenlit the small block V8 and bankrolled the Corvette program. Thomas had one pitch: let me build a car that kills the Cobra. Use Chevrolet parts. Build it off GM property. Keep it invisible to the executives upstairs. Cole said yes and connected Thomas with Vince Piggins, head of General Motors Performance Products Group. Piggins became the supply line: a fuel-injected 327 cubic inch Corvette V8, a Muncie 4-speed manual, a C2 Corvette independent rear differential, heavy-duty NASCAR spec drum brakes, all funneled to a hot rod shop in Anaheim, California, with no purchasing order, no engineering department sign-off, no paper trail anywhere inside General Motors. One condition: build 100 cars. That was the FIA minimum to homologate a production vehicle for international sports car racing. 100 cheetahs on the grid meant legal eligibility to race the Cobra head-to-head. Thomas agreed. His chief fabricator was Don Edmonds. Edmonds took the Corvette drivetrain Piggins had delivered, laid every piece of it on the concrete floor of the Anaheim shop, and drew the chassis around them in chalk. Not on paper, not in a drafting room. White chalk on a garage floor. One rule governed the layout: push the engine as far back as it will physically go. Edmonds shoved the 327 so deep into the frame that the transmission bolted directly to the rear differential through a single universal joint. There was no drive shaft. The driver sat alongside the engine block with exhaust headers routed directly over the footwells. At racing speed, cockpit temperatures climbed past 150 degrees. The frame was 4,130 chrome moly steel tubing. Suspension came from the C2 Corvette parts bin. The first two bodies were hand-shaped aluminum, formed by California metal shaping over a plywood buck that Edmonds built onto the rolling chassis. Every car after that got a fiberglass shell to cut cost and speed up production. Wheelbase, 90 inches. Overall length, 140 inches. Curb weight landed somewhere between 1,500 and 1,650 pounds depending on the build. A Shelby Cobra 427 weighed 2,355 pounds. The Cheetah was 800 pounds lighter than the car it was supposed to race. But there was a problem nobody saw coming. The Cheetah was never designed as a race car. Thomas originally intended it as a concept vehicle, a styling exercise to show GM the caliber of work his shop could do. A cruiser, not a competitor. The decision to race it came after construction had already started. The chassis had been engineered for show, not for the lateral loads of a racetrack. That would become obvious almost immediately. The Cheetah was supposed to debut at the 1963 Los Angeles Times Grand Prix at Riverside. 2 days before the race, Don Horvath crashed it during practice and destroyed the aluminum body. Thomas pulled the wreckage back to Anaheim, stripped the body off, and replaced it with a fiberglass shell. February 1st, 1964. Riverside International Raceway. First sanctioned race. Jerry Titus was behind the wheel. Titus was a contributing editor at Sports Car Graphic Magazine, a future Trans Am champion, a future inductee into the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America. End of the first lap, a water hose blew off the engine and sprayed coolant under the rear tires. The car went sideways and off the track. 2 events, 2 wrecks, not a single completed lap. Titus kept racing the Cheetah through 1964 anyway, and he kept writing about it. His coverage in Sports Car Graphic gave the project credibility when the on-track results gave it none. The driver who actually proved the Cheetah could win was Ralph Salyer. Salyer bought the third car, a fiberglass coupe, and handed it to his mechanic, Gene Crow. Crow took one look at the cockpit heat problem and did the most obvious thing possible: cut the roof off. He converted the closed coupe into an open roadster. They called it the Crow Sal Special. Salyer won 11 races across 1964 and 1965, but not against the Cobra. Because Thomas had built fewer than 100 cars, the SCCA refused to let the Cheetah compete in A production, the class where the Cobras raced. Instead, the SCCA dropped the Cheetah into C Sports Modified, the category reserved for prototype-level race machinery. Salyer's 11 wins came against Lolas, McLarens, and Chaparrals. The car Chevrolet built to kill the Cobra never once raced the Cobra on a sanctioned grid. Meanwhile, during qualifying laps at Daytona International Speedway, Jerry Grant pushed a Cheetah to 215 miles per hour on the high banking. Don Edmonds was in the pits and confirmed the number himself. The Shelby Cobra 427's published top speed sat at 165. The Cheetah beat it by 50 miles per hour. On a small block 327, not even a big block. Then the FIA moved the goalposts. In 1964, the minimum production count for homologation jumped from 100 cars to 1,000. Bill Thomas had maybe 11 completed cars sitting in an Anaheim garage. The math was over. GM looked at the situation from a different angle entirely. A federal antitrust investigation was already bearing down on the corporation. The last thing GM's legal department needed was another covert racing program leaking into public view. Chevrolet told Piggins to shut down the parts pipeline. Thomas kept building. A prototype they called the Super Cheetah was taking shape in the shop. Wider cockpit, revised suspension geometry. Engineering feedback from Bob Bondurant and Jerry Titus had been folded into the redesign. The car was getting faster and the handling problems that had plagued the original were being solved one by one. September 9, 1965. Fire. The Anaheim factory burned. It took the wooden body bucks Edmonds had carved to form the fiberglass panels. It took the tooling. It took the unfinished cars on the shop floor. It took the Super Cheetah prototype. Bill Thomas walked through what was left and made the call to shut everything down. There was nothing left to rebuild with. Between 11 and 15 Cheetahs were ever finished, depending on which registry you trust. One of them ended up in an Elvis Presley film called Spin Out. Most of them disappeared into private collections and stayed there for decades. In 2018, an original Cheetah sold at auction for $625,000. A Shelby Cobra 427 routinely changes hands for north of $1.8 million. The car that lost is worth 3 times more than the car that was faster. Bill Thomas died on October 10, 2009. He never rebuilt the Cheetah. He never got the rematch. There is a version of this story where the FIA keeps the rule at 100 cars. Thomas hits the number by mid-1964. The Cheetah gets homologated. A production. Same grid as the Cobra. 1,500 pounds against 2,300. A small block 327 against a big block 427, and the small block is already 50 miles per hour faster in a straight line. Carroll Shelby would have had a problem. That version did not happen. What happened instead was a rule change, a funding cut, and a fire. 3 things in that order, 12 months apart. Any one of them alone, and Thomas might have recovered. All 3 together, and the car was erased so completely that most Cobra historians have never mentioned it. Chevrolet spent almost nothing to develop the fastest car in American racing in 1964. Then they spent even less making sure nobody remembered it.